Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another gently narrated expedition into the annals of antiquity. This is the boring historian, where the past meanders slowly and the stories are told like a whisper through cobwebbed corridors of time. Tonight, allow your mind to float lazily down the winding river of ancient justice as we explore some of the most bizarre, bewildering, and yes, sleepily fascinating punishments devised by the civilizations of old. So find your quiet place, settle in, perhaps tuck in a little tighter, and let us begin. Justice, in the ancient world, was a different creature than we know today. Sometimes poetic, sometimes cruel, often strange, so very strange. Not meant to be fair by today's eyes, but symbolic, ritualistic, or divine. Before you settle in, please hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss any sleepy historical tales. And as your eyelids grow heavier, we will explore the odd shapes justice once took. Not with fear, but with curiosity, with quiet wonder. Let us begin our first tale. It is said that history remembers the victors, but it never forgets the punished. Long before our modern courts and prison cells, before the gavels and the lawyers and the appeals, justice took on a stranger shape, a slower one that burned, bled, humiliated, and sometimes did not end with death, but with memory. There were no uniform laws, no standardized crimes, only rulers with trembling hands and gods that demanded order. And when order broke, punishment followed, not as correction, but as theater. A message carved into skin, branded onto eyes, stretched across bone for others to see, to fear, to obey. And what strange messages they were. Somewhere in the arid courts of ancient Persia, a man lies bound between two boats, his limbs slicked in honey. The air stirs, thick with the scent of rot and milk. Flies gather. Days pass. He is still alive. His body begins to melt in the sun, not with fire, but with time. This is not execution. This is scaphism, the slow death by insects, rot, and shame. They say his screams turned to gurgles, that he begged for death long before it came, that even the gods turned their gaze. But Persia was only one corner of the world. Travel east, where the morning light touches the stone gates of Chang'an, and there justice is a thousandfold whisper. One cut, then another, a cheek, a shoulder, a thigh, each slice deliberate, each meant to weigh the soul. This is Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts, reserved not for thieves or drunkards, but for those who defied the state, who tore at the fabric of harmony. It was not just a death, it was the unmaking of a person. Further still, across deserts and seas, elephants stand in circles, not wild but royal, their eyes painted, their tusks shined. These are no ordinary beasts, they are judges, executioners. One movement of the king's hand, and a man will be trampled, not in chaos, but in choreography. Sometimes they delay the kill, pick up the body, toss it, crush it slowly. The crowd watches. The court applauds. The elephant waits for the signal. In the kingdoms of ancient India, punishment wore a gilded face and walked on 4 legs. Not all punishments, though, were loud. In the colder corners of Europe, they could be almost silent. A man might be sewn into a sack with a rooster, a monkey, a dog, and a snake, and thrown into a river. This is poena kule, for those who killed their fathers. The sack becomes a tumbling chaos of fur, feathers, and teeth. The water welcomes them. No one returns. And in the golden lands along the Nile, beneath the eyes of gods with falcon heads and jackal faces, the crime of tomb robbing was answered not merely with death, but with mutilation. Hands gone, noses carved away, eyes removed so the soul could not see its path. The body left in the desert, unburied. A message: disturb the dead, and you forfeit your place among them. Justice in the ancient world was not meant to rehabilitate. It was meant to echo, across cities, through generations, into the marrow of children who would one day stand in judgment themselves. And in Rome, ever the lover of spectacle, the punished were part of the program. At noon, between the games and the blood, they brought in the condemned. Some were thrown to lions, some were burned, some reenacted myths, dying the deaths of Icarus or Orpheus in gruesome parody. It wasn't enough to execute. Rome demanded story, theatre, laughter, and when the sand turned red, it was only swept away for the next act. But perhaps stranger than all these were the punishments reserved not for people, but for things. In ancient Athens, if a statue fell and killed someone, it was tried in court. If guilty, it was exiled, thrown into the sea, or outside the city walls. Objects could pollute. Animals, too. A dog that bit. A donkey that kicked. They could be executed in public, sometimes in the same manner as men. It was not madness. It was logic in a world where divine balance governed all. The body was a canvas. The soul, a question mark. And punishment? It was the brush that painted order back into the picture. They peeled the skin from traitors in Assyria, slowly, methodically, sometimes still alive. They nailed the flayed skin to the gates of the city, a second skin, worn by the stone as a reminder. In Sicily, a bronze bull waited, hollow, gleaming. The door opened. A man stepped in, or was forced in. A fire was lit beneath. Inside, he screamed, but the tubes inside the bull turned his cries into the sound of bellowing. So from the outside, it was not a man dying, but a beast roaring. Article justice, horror. Even children sometimes were not spared. In certain Spartan rituals, boys were whipped at altars to test their endurance. They bled for hours. Some died, but their deaths were not called tragedy. They were called honor. You may ask, why? Why so cruel? Why so strange? Because the world was not kind. It was raw. The gods did not forgive. They judged. Kings did not rule gently. They feared revolt. Cities were not built on peace. They were built on warning. And so, when a man stole, he lost a hand. When he lied, he lost his tongue. When he betrayed, he lost his name, his face, his place in the world. Sometimes he was branded. Sometimes buried alive. Sometimes blinded, so that the last thing he saw was the face of justice. Some punishments were religious, others political. Some were born of paranoia, others of ritual. In the Maya world, losing a sacred ball game could mean death, not as punishment, but as offering, a gift to the gods, a necessary balance. In medieval Japan, crucifixion was not always immediate. The body could hang for days, arrows shot through joints, no mercy, just exposure, suffering beneath an open sky. And still, the strangest punishment of all was perhaps forgetting, to be erased. Your name scratched from stone, your body buried without markers, your memory stricken from the records. This, too, was death, but colder, quieter. It was as if you had never lived, for in many ancient cultures, memory was immortality, and to lose it was a fate worse than death. And so the ancients punished not only the body, but the soul, the future, the story you would become. These tales, buried in scrolls and carved into stone, still whisper. In dusty archives, in the corners of museums, in the half-remembered phrases of lost tongues. They are strange. They are brutal. They are unforgettable, just like the punishments they describe. Let us slip deeper into history's quieter shadows, where justice drifted between nightmare and ritual, and punishment came not with a gavel, but with silence, fire, and time. Imagine a city. It is night. The torches are low. The streets whisper with wind, and in the public square a single post rises, wooden, worn smooth by countless hands before. A man stands beside it, or kneels, or is dragged. No one speaks loudly. There is no need. Everyone knows what happens next. In ancient Babylon, where law was born from the hands of gods and kings, the Code of Hammurabi spelled justice in stone, tall, black basalt, etched with divine instruction. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the people said. But justice was never so simple. If a builder's house collapsed and killed its owner, the builder's son might die in his place. If a man struck another man's father, his own hand might be severed. The law did not balance the scales. It mirrored them. It reflected harm, not always to the one who caused it, but sometimes to those they loved most. So the punishment became a curse, a sorrow you watched unfold, helpless. And so a man would not scream for his own life, but for his son's. Far to the north, in the forests of ancient Scandinavia, where the breath of the gods moved through pine and frost, justice took a darker form. The sagas speak of a punishment so terrible it was spoken in whispers, the blood eagle, a ritual of vengeance, not justice, or perhaps both, depending on who told the tale. The victim, often a betrayer, a traitor, a breaker of oaths, was bound, arms stretched wide like wings. The ribs were sliced from the spine, the lungs pulled out through the wounds and draped over the shoulders like wings, and the body was left open, breathing, bleeding beneath the sky. No mercy, only wind, only stars. It is debated whether it was ever truly practiced or merely feared, but in dreams and memories it took root. Sometimes the idea is more powerful than the act. Sometimes imagining it is punishment enough. In the heart of the Aztec Empire, where stone temples reached like blades into the sky, the blood of captives fed the sun. Human sacrifice was not punishment in the ordinary sense. It was necessity. The gods required motion. The stars demanded balance. Hearts were the currency of cosmic order. But among the victims were not only war captives, but adulterers, thieves, liars. Crime blurred into ritual. The punished ascended the temple steps not as prisoners, but as offerings. They were laid on the obsidian slab, and with a single cut, the heart was removed while still beating, raised to the sun, given back to the sky. It was not cruelty, they believed. It was duty, and as the blood ran down the steps, the people below sang, "Let your eyes grow heavier now. Let your breath slow. The stories will not leave. They linger like smoke in an old room." In ancient Egypt, the land of orderly death, where bodies were preserved and names were spells, the punishment for defiling a tomb was severe, not because of the physical crime, but because of the spiritual one. To rob a tomb was to unbalance the eternal order. The body of the thief might be dismembered, his tongue removed, his name cursed on papyrus and stone to be forgotten in the afterlife. And that, in Egypt, was the true punishment, to be denied passage, denied eternity. Sometimes the bodies of thieves were burned, a rare horror in Egyptian law, for fire destroyed the soul's vessel. To burn a man's corpse was to annihilate his spirit, not death, erasure. So while the body burned, the soul screamed in silence. Now drift east again, to the courts of ancient China, where the emperor ruled with the mandate of heaven. There, justice unfolded like ceremony, elegant, exact, and sometimes terrifying. A woman might be punished not with death, but with silence, her feet crushed into lotus shape from childhood, a lifetime of slow mutilation called beauty, a crime not hers, perhaps, but of the culture around her. Still, she paid the price, step by painful step. Others faced more direct punishment, branding, tattooing, exile to distant provinces where language did not reach, the removal of noses, ears, genitals, punishments that left the body marked not for pain's sake alone, but to mark shame, to carry guilt in the flesh, forever. Some were condemned to the 9 familial exterminations, not one life, but generations. If a man was found guilty of treason, his children, parents, cousins, uncles, sometimes even teachers could be put to death, not because they acted, but because they were near. Proximity was poison. This was punishment expanded into lineage, like a slow spreading shadow. And while the knife fell swiftly, the fear lingered, like a cold wind in a closed room. Across the seas, in the Polynesian Isles, justice moved quieter. Punishments were not always visible, but they were no less cruel. A man might be declared tapu, cursed, forbidden, untouchable. He would be cast out, not with violence, but with silence. No one could speak to him, feed him, look him in the eyes. And so he starved, surrounded by people, alone in the crowd, dying not from wounds, but from the absence of voice. Sometimes punishment was not a scream. Sometimes it was a hush. Even in medieval Europe, where iron and fire marked the heretic and the witch, punishment often wore the mask of piety. The Iron Maiden, a spiked sarcophagus rumored to exist, though debated, was said to hold its victims in cold embrace. Spikes just far enough to pierce but not kill, bleeding slowly, dying surrounded by metal in the shape of a woman or a saint. Whether real or legend, it spoke to the fear of hidden pain, pain that came in darkness, in silence, out of sight. And in the Inquisition, punishment was a quiet drowning. Water poured not to cleanse, but to flood. The strappado, where arms were tied behind the back and the body dropped, not to break, but to dislocate. The wheel, where limbs were shattered one at a time. All done in the name of purity. All whispered as mercy. Are you drifting yet? Let the mind grow soft. Let the body settle. There is more. Always more. Somewhere in Africa, under the sun-stained branches of the baobab tree, justice was restorative, but no less strange. A man who killed might be forced to live among the victim's family, to serve them for life, to raise the dead man's children, not as punishment through pain, but through burden. A lifetime of presence, of memory, of uncomfortable peace. And in some tribes, the punishment for adultery was not death, but song. The entire village would surround the accused, not with stones, but with stories. Every wrong they had done would be sung aloud, their cruelty, their dishonesty, their pride. No violence, just exposure. Every hidden act brought into the sun. Sometimes punishment is the mirror, and sometimes the mirror cracks. Now let the thoughts quiet. Let the images blur. The bull, the sack, the flame, the blade. They recede like waves, fading into shadow. History does not sleep, but you can. Its strangest punishments still echo, like the wind through old ruins, like voices beneath the floor. They speak in tongues long dead, in rituals half remembered. They are not gone, merely waiting, Close your eyes. The stories will be here when you return. Through layers of dust, silence, and memory, the world grows darker, but not crueler, only stranger. Stranger still. Each punishment you hear now is not a footnote in a dusty scroll, not a line from a scholar's page, but a whisper from the shadows. Something once real, felt, remembered, and you are safe. Here, listening, as the centuries pass overhead like clouds. In the shadowed alleys of ancient Greece, a city once prided itself on reason. Athens, the birthplace of philosophy, democracy, logic. And yet, even here, punishment could take a curious shape, not always brutal, but strangely surgical. Ostracism. Once a year, the citizens gathered in the agora. Each scratched a name onto a potsherd, a shard of broken clay. Not the name of a criminal, but of someone dangerous, someone powerful, too loud, too persuasive, too ambitious. If a name was written too often, that man would be exiled. For 10 years. No trial, no defense, no blood spilled, just absence. And so, the greatest men of Athens vanished, not with swords, but with silence, to be forgotten slowly while still breathing. That was the Athenian blade. And in Sparta, stern Sparta, where boys became soldiers and mercy was weakness, punishment was training. At age 7, boys were taken from their mothers, whipped, starved, made to steal. But if they were caught, they were beaten not for theft, but for being careless. One story tells of a boy who stole a fox and hid it under his tunic. The fox clawed his belly, bit through skin and muscle. The boy said nothing. He died quietly, his face calm, never revealing pain. That, to them, was strength. That was glory. But it was also punishment, a lifetime of pain masked as pride. Now let us turn westward again, to the Roman world. The Romans were great engineers of law. They built roads, aqueducts, and punishments with equal skill. Their methods, cold and organized, efficient, designed not only to kill, but to communicate. One punishment they favored for slaves and traitors: crucifixion. We think of it now as a Christian symbol, but to the Romans it was the lowest of deaths, long, public, humiliating. A body nailed not high above the crowd, but just above eye level, close enough to see the pain, to hear the gasping, to smell the rot. It was not the nails that killed, it was time, the slow weight of the body pulling against its own lungs. Suffocation. Days of it. Buzzing flies, mocking crowds, helplessness. And when death finally came, the body was left to rot. A warning, not just to rebels, but to everyone. In Roman eyes, even death had hierarchy. A citizen might be beheaded, quick, clean, respectful. A slave, a rebel, a foreigner. They were made to suffer in the open air. And yet, stranger still were the punishments for Roman Vestal virgins, the sacred priestesses of Vesta, keepers of the eternal flame. If one broke her vow of chastity, she could not simply be executed. That would spill sacred blood, so she was buried alive, given a small chamber beneath the earth, a lamp, a little food, a bed, and sealed in silence. The flame above continued, but below it flickered out. Now the flames grow low in your mind, the shadows longer, and time begins to blur. In medieval France, there is a trial, not of a man or a woman, but of a pig. The pig stands accused of murder. The court gathers. Witnesses speak. A lawyer is appointed for the pig. The judge hears the arguments, and the pig is sentenced to death by hanging. This was not a joke. It was law. A belief that animals, too, could commit crimes, and that justice, to be whole, must extend even to the beasts. Cats were burned in squares for consorting with devils. Rats were excommunicated. Locusts were warned. And if they did not leave a vineyard, a priest might curse them. Even nature was expected to obey the law, and when it did not, it was punished. Somewhere in Eastern Europe, long before the borders, a woman is accused of witchcraft. She is not burned, not yet. First, she is weighed, against a Bible, against a sack of stones, then stripped, examined for the devil's mark, a mole, a scar, a place that does not bleed. Then the water. She is tied, lowered into a river. If she floats, she is guilty, the water rejecting her. If she sinks, she is innocent, but drowned. This was called ordeal. Trial not by law, but by elements. Fire, water, iron. Justice left to nature, or fate, or God. It is quiet now. Let that quiet stay with you. Let it soften your breath. Let's drift, softly, to Mesopotamia, one of the oldest places to write its justice down. There, an adulterous woman might be thrown into the river. If she drowned, the gods had judged her. If she lived, she was innocent. A builder whose wall collapsed could be stoned. A son who struck his father could have his hand cut off. A midwife whose error led to a stillbirth might be blinded. Punishment in that world was a kind of math, a debt paid in flesh. But let us not stay in blood alone. Some punishments were absurd, ridiculous, performed more for ridicule than pain. In medieval England, a woman who gossiped too loudly could be forced to wear the scold's bridle, a metal cage around her head with a tongue piece to press down, slice, or immobilize. She would be led through the village. People would laugh, children would follow, and the silence would be forced. Another, the ducking stool, a wooden seat on a long arm, dunked repeatedly in water, not to drown, just to humiliate. Because in some places, shame was sharper than any blade. Now, further still, across frozen rivers and quiet forests in ancient Russia, where exile was the ultimate sentence. You wouldn't be killed. You would simply be removed, sent to the taiga, or the tundra, or the edge of nothing. You would live if you could. But not with people, not with name. Punishment was not pain. It was forgetting. It was the long cold. Even now, perhaps, someone is buried under that snow, and no one remembers why. The night deepens. Your body is still. The breath is soft. The room quiet. The stories slow. And still, they come. In medieval Japan, there was tsurushi, a slow suspension by the ankles, often over a pit. The weight pulled downward. The blood rushed to the head. Sometimes water was dripped on the forehead. Sometimes not. It could last hours, days. A punishment not meant to kill, only to hurt, quietly, repeatedly. And then there was buried execution, where the condemned was planted up to the neck and left in the sun. Flies, ants, dehydration, madness. The body became part of the land, but not peacefully. Now, return to the Middle East, to ancient Judea, where stoning was practiced, but not as chaos, as ritual. The crowd participated, each with a stone. No single hand delivered death, but all did. This was meant to share guilt, or to dilute it, or perhaps to hide it. For if everyone kills, then no one did. And if no one did, maybe the stone threw itself. Sleep now, or drift. Let the sounds become softer, the thoughts slower. We are not finished, but we are quiet now. Justice, in its strangest forms, has walked every continent, every empire, every century. But now it walks more slowly, in dreams, in memory. Close your eyes. Let the stories fall away, like leaves from old trees. The punishments are over for now. But history always waits. Let us slip further still, through deeper silence, down corridors where time forgets itself. The The stories continue, soft and strange. The air grows heavier now, not with fear, but with stillness, a hush that history itself cannot break. Let us return, not to one land, but to many, to a strange punishment whispered across cultures, the execution by elephant. In ancient India, and later across parts of Southeast Asia and even Persia, elephants were not only beasts of burden, not only creatures of war, but instruments of law. These were not mindless animals, but trained participants in justice. A man condemned might be laid before the elephant. Sometimes the command was given, and the creature crushed him underfoot with deliberate slowness. First the limbs, then the ribs, then the skull, 1 foot at a time, deliberate, as if the elephant too understood guilt. But there were variations. The elephant might be commanded to toss the man into the air, to tear him with tusks, to press him gently into the earth until breath was gone, and perhaps most terrifying, some elephants had been trained to pause, to hover a foot above the man's chest, to wait until the emperor gave the nod, a mercy or a denial of it. This was punishment not as fury, but as theatre, a public ceremony of control, where life and death danced on the edge of a single command. And sometimes mercy was granted. The elephant spared the guilty, and the people cheered. The show was complete. But imagine now, lying on your back, staring up at that vast foot, unmoving above you, waiting, not knowing. Let that thought drift away. Let the breath slow. We move now to the Byzantine Empire, where politics and punishment danced a delicate waltz of velvet and blood. To kill a rival could create martyrdom, so the state preferred mutilation. A general who failed might have his nose cut off, his eyes gouged, his tongue removed, not to silence him, but to disqualify him. For in Byzantine law, a disfigured man could not rule. And yet, history remembers Justinian II, who had his nose sliced off, exiled, and left to rot on the edge of empire. He returned, wearing a golden prosthetic, and reclaiming his throne. Sometimes punishment merely scars, but scars can still rise. The golden nose glinted in the torchlight of the throne room, and the empire bowed. Now drift softly westward again to medieval Germany, where punishment came not in the form of iron or exile, but music. The shame flute, or Schandflöte, was a heavy metal contraption shaped like a flute, clamped around the neck and hands. It forced the guilty, usually a bad musician or loudmouth, to play their silent tune while being marched through the streets. The holes of the instrument could not be used. No sound emerged, only mockery. It was not pain they sought, but ridicule. A punishment played in laughter and side-eyes, in whispers and shame. And as the fool walked, silenced by his metal flute, perhaps the song in his head was louder than any he had played before. Somewhere between laughter and silence, justice found a melody. And now let's return, briefly, lightly, to the Ottoman Empire. There, for crimes of treason, desertion, or failure, a man might face the sack. Not just any sack, but one sewn shut with the man inside. Alongside wild animals, a monkey, a snake, a dog. The sack was thrown into the Bosphorus, and beneath the water, chaos unfolded. No blade, no fire, just fabric and fur and fangs. This punishment, known as sack execution or sewn drowning, existed to magnify fear. The man did not die alone, but surrounded by unpredictable terror. You can almost feel the water cool and rising, the struggle unseen, the breath shortening. Now let it pass. Let the tide go out. Let us walk gently to a different age. Revolutionary France. Here, justice had a new toy, the guillotine. And though we think of it as brutal, it was born of mercy. Dr. Guillotin proposed it as a clean death, equal, swift, democratic, a blade for nobles and peasants alike. And indeed, it was swift, but not always painless. For after the head fell, some claimed it blinked, that eyes moved, that lips twitched. Could thought remain for seconds? Could terror or memory? The blade cut clean, but the mystery bled on, and for a time heads were placed in baskets, not to rot, but to watch. You could almost hear the creak of the wood, the soft thud, the sigh of the crowd. Now drift from the blade, let it fall behind, like a curtain, and wander east again, to Persia. Ancient Persia, and one of history's most dreadful punishments, scaphism. It began with 2 boats, or 2 halves of a hollow log. The man was placed inside, limbs protruding. His body was smeared with milk and honey. He was left on a stagnant pond. Insects came, first flies, then wasps, then worms. Day by day they nested, laid eggs, burrowed. The man was fed, to prolong the agony, and when he could no longer eat, the waste added to the filth. More insects, more rot. He did not die quickly, he died by decay, not punishment by blade, but by life. And in the silence of that pond, under the buzzing of 1,000 wings, he may have begged for the knife. Sleep now if you can, or simply drift. History grows darker still. There are punishments buried in cultures now gone, civilizations without names. In Mesoamerica, beyond the great temples, there was the flower war, ritual conflict, where the goal was not territory, but captives. To feed the gods, the prisoners knew their fate. They were not beaten, not tortured. They were celebrated, federal, dressed well, paraded, and then laid on the sacrificial stone. It was not punishment for crime, but punishment for being born on the wrong side of the border. Sometimes, just being there was enough. Now we return to England, where the heretic's fork awaited the blasphemer. A metal rod with prongs facing up and down, fastened between the chin and the chest, or the throat and the sternum. If the wearer lowered their head, the prongs pierced. No sleep, no nod, no prayer, only upright, eternal wakefulness. And above it, a sign, I renounced God. Pain was not needed, only posture and time. Now we turn to the punishments of slaves in ancient Rome, often kept silent in public accounts, but lingering in graffiti, in fragments. Some were branded, with letters across the forehead. F.U.G., fugitivus, runaway. Others were forced to wear iron collars inscribed with messages. I belong to my master. If found, return me. He will reward you. The punishment was not escape, but being caught and returned. Some slaves were sewn into bags with snakes, others crucified not at the city gate, but along the roads, reminders, mile after mile. And yet some were never punished by pain, only by the fact that they could be punished at all. Even freedom, when granted, was called manumission, a gift, a letting go, not a right, a favor. Let that settle in the breath. Let it grow still. And now, southward, to the Zulu kingdom, where a warrior's failure could lead to being clubbed to death by his own regiment, not in rage, in duty. The blows were not wild, they were precise. The fallen warrior did not scream. He accepted. This was not considered cruelty, but loyalty. The regiment must be pure, and so death became purification. Each blow was a hymn, each silence a burial. Now, slowly, softly, we end this passage. The fire in the mind dims. The shadows return to their corners. You are safe. You are still. These punishments, though strange and brutal and beautiful in their own terrible ways, are no longer yours. They belong to history. And history now sleeps. Let us drift onward, deeper still into this tapestry of strangeness and severity. The air thickens with time, and the voices of the past speak softer now, like echoes inside a sealed tomb. Let us listen. Somewhere in the humid forests of Southeast Asia, among the ancient Khmer, a punishment known only through oral memory survives: the red ant cage. A criminal, perhaps a thief, perhaps a rival, would be stripped and confined to a bamboo frame, neck clamped between stocks. Nearby, the executioner would produce a carefully tended colony of red fire ants, stored in woven baskets. The ants would be poured slowly over the bound man's body, often starting with the armpits, the eyes, or the soft flesh of the groin. Ant by ant, bite by bite. There were no cuts, no blood spilled in haste, only welts, swelling, madness, a fire under the skin, and silence. The ants made no sound, but they carved pain more thoroughly than steel. Some men confessed everything. Some screamed until their voices vanished. A few simply stopped. Not dead, just no longer present. There is something deeply ancient in that image, to be punished not by men, but by nature. Insects, not soldiers. Let us leave them behind. Let us go north now, to ancient Scandinavia, and breathe the iron wind of Viking lore. Among their darker punishments was the blood eagle. Its historicity is debated, but its legend lingers. A captured enemy, perhaps a noble, perhaps a traitor, was laid on his belly. The ribs were severed from the spine, pulled outward, the lungs drawn out, folded over the shoulders. They called this the eagle's wings. It is said the victim remained conscious, that the agony was not immediate death, that the ritual was sacred, reserved for special vengeance, an offering to Odin, to the gods of war and sky. Whether real or not, the story has weight. It has survived not in bone, but in myth. And sometimes myth is the heavier truth. Now let us sail far from the frost, to the golden deserts of North Africa, to Carthage. There, beneath the ancient sun, stood an altar, tall, hot, hollow. To some it was called the Tophet, a place of child sacrifice. Records, mostly Roman, claim that unwanted or promised children were placed into the arms of a bronze idol. A furnace roared beneath it. The arms tilted, and the child slid down into the fire. The truth is unclear. The archaeologists still argue. But the bones are real. Whether sacrifice or burial, the children are there. Thousands, carefully interred, marked with stones and prayers. Punishment? Perhaps not in the usual sense, but a culture's own rules, written in flame and grief. Let's leave now, quietly, to ancient Korea under the Goryeo and early Joseon dynasties. Here, among officials and scholars, honor was everything, and shame could be terminal. Exile to the borderlands was common, a quiet, slow death, not by sword, but by erasure. But some crimes, treason, conspiracy, heresy, called for a more symbolic end, slow slicing or lingchi, borrowed and shared through time with neighboring China. The condemned was bound before a public crowd and cut, not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Methodically, the cheeks, the breasts, the limbs, over and over until the body fell apart like fabric. It was not just to kill, it was to unmake, to dissolve the self. In some versions, the final stroke was a mercy, the heart. But sometimes that came far too late. Now let that horror fade, like smoke from incense. And let us pause among the Aztecs again, who offered punishments that were both beautiful and cruel. A young man caught stealing might be shaved bald and paraded through the streets, his skin painted with ash, his ears pierced with cactus spines. For a second offense, a foot might be cut off, not to kill, but to cripple, to mark, to make his body a map of his crimes. But sometimes there was redemption. A prisoner destined for sacrifice could win his freedom in the gladiatorial stone. He would be tied by the ankle to a circular stone platform, given a club. His opponents, 5, 6, more, would come armed and unbound. If he survived, he earned release. Few did. But that shimmer of hope, that shimmer, however cruel, was part of the punishment. Now close your eyes and listen for the sound of marching. Slow, steady. We are in imperial China, where bureaucracy ruled with paper and ink, but beneath the paper, iron. Among the many strange punishments of the Qing dynasty was the congé, a heavy wooden board worn around the neck, large and flat, like a table one could not put down. It bore your name, your crime, sometimes your sentence. You could not feed yourself. You could not lie down. You stood. You waited. You begged. Sometimes for a day, sometimes for weeks. And when the sentence ended, if it ended, the wood was removed, but the neck often could not bear its own weight. A lifetime of bowed shame carried in the spine. Others faced the 9 familial exterminations, a punishment reserved for traitors. The guilty man would be executed, but so would his parents, his siblings, his children, his grandchildren, his teachers, his students, even servants. It was not enough to kill the man. The idea of him had to die. Blood was not enough. Memory itself was sentenced. Now breathe, deeply, slowly. Feel the weight of centuries settle around you like a blanket, not to smother, but to still. Let us move again, westward, to medieval Italy, to Venice, where silence was a form of law. There stood the Bocca di Leone, the lion's mouth, a carved slot in the wall where citizens could drop anonymous accusations against neighbors, against rivals, against lovers. The state listened, and if the accusation stuck, the accused might be imprisoned in the pozzi, the wells, damp stone cells beneath the Doge's palace. No light, no sound, just dripping, dripping, dripping. Time itself became the punishment. Now, finally for this passage, we walk slowly to West Africa, to the Ashanti Kingdom, where justice was sacred, administered by priests and witnessed by ancestors. A man found guilty of sacrilege might be sentenced not to die, but to become a ghost in life. His name erased from the village rolls, no one allowed to speak to him, or feed him, or help him. He wandered, he withered. The living would not look him in the eye. He was buried not in the earth, but in silence. Punishment without whip, without jail, only the slow exile from the world of the spoken. Now, let the voices fade. Let the tales loosen their grip, like sleep loosens the body's hold on wakefulness. Let the punishment pass. There are more stories, deeper ones. But for now, let your breath return to the surface. The night deepens. The tales grow stranger. The edge between waking and dreaming thins. Let us descend again, slowly, to where the oldest punishments still breathe beneath stone, bone, and dust. We go now to feudal Japan, to the lands of shoguns and daimyo, where punishment was not only for justice, but for honor. There, a samurai faced not prison, but the blade of his own hand, in the ritual of seppuku. It was not punishment imposed by the court, but by the soul, a way to reclaim dignity in death when disgrace had taken it in life. The condemned man, often dressed in white, would kneel on tatami mats. Before him, a short blade, cleaned and waiting. He would cut across his abdomen, deep, slow, horizontal first, then upward, a gesture of self-opening, of release. The act was excruciating and incomplete. Behind him stood a second, the kaisha kunin, a fellow warrior, usually a friend, tasked with ending the pain in a single, swift strike. The head was not fully severed, only enough to fold forward, to bow in death. A perfect death, a bloody silence. But there were others too. Buried alive, the punishment for wives of samurai who were unfaithful, set into the earth upright as the dirt closed around their bodies. No blade, no fire, just the slow weight of soil and shame. Even stillness was a sentence. Now, let us lift from that soil and move to ancient Israel, to the time of the first temple, where law was divine and punishment bore the weight of eternity. There was the stoning pit, a method laid out in detail in sacred texts. The condemned was led to a high platform, pushed off. If death did not come from the fall, stones followed, large, heavy, thrown not in fury, but in obedience. The crowd did not scream. There was no chant, just dust and gravity, and the steady thud of justice as dictated by the heavens. Yet even there, compassion was written in the law. One stone by the accuser, then others. A system, a ritual, not rage. Punishment as process. Now wander across time to the Middle Ages in Eastern Europe, to the cold forests of Wallachia. To Vlad III Dracula, known not for fiction, but for his favoured sentence: impalement. The stake was not sharp, it was not designed to kill quickly. It was wide, oiled, rounded. The victim was lowered onto it, slowly, through the lower body, carefully angled to avoid vital organs. They did not die in minutes. They died in days. Sometimes the stake emerged through the mouth, sometimes the chest, sometimes it never did. And all the while they remained upright, like grotesque trees along the roadsides, warning all who passed, do not stray. It is said the fields of Vlad's enemies swayed with impaled bodies, and the smell of blood was carried for miles. Justice, in his world, was not hidden. It stood tall, in agony. Now turn away, gently. Let us follow something quieter. Let us float to the Incan Empire, high in the Andes, where the punishment for theft, especially within the royal storehouses, was to be cast from the mountains. A ritual known as takai, it was not just about death. It was about removal. The condemned was not beaten, not mocked. They were taken to a sacred peak, sometimes given coca leaves to chew, sometimes blindfolded, and then they stepped, or were pushed, and the wind carried them away. The punishment was not just for the living, but for the gods of the mountains, who now received the fallen. Justice was high, cold, absolute. Let that wind pass over you now. Feel it leave. And now we descend into ancient Egypt, where punishments were strange echoes of eternity. For certain crimes, such as grave robbing or defiling sacred texts, the punishment was not only death, but erasure. A practice called damnatio memoriae, the destruction of one's name, one's statues, one's hieroglyphs. Your image was chipped away from stone walls, your name scratched from the book of the dead. Without a name, you could not live in the afterlife. It was the soul, not the body, that suffered most. Even pharaohs, if disgraced, could vanish. Entire reigns erased from the king lists, sculptures buried, faces scratched blank, a death beyond death. You could walk past the tomb of such a man. and never know he ruled. Even silence becomes a sentence. Let's move now to medieval Russia, where punishment could be elemental. A woman accused of witchcraft might face trial by freezing. She was tied to a post in a river in the dead of winter. As the river froze, the ice crept up her body, inch by inch. If she survived until morning, she might be spared. If not, the body remained frozen in place like a statue, a warning, a relic of cold judgment. Others were tied to sleighs and dragged through snow-laden fields until they no longer moved. Pain was not shouted. It was whispered through frostbite and stillness. Let's drift from the cold now. Warm your thoughts in the deserts of ancient Mesopotamia. In the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest recorded systems of law, punishment was mathematically precise. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But there was also trial by river. The accused was thrown into the Euphrates. If the river accepted him, he survived and was declared innocent. If the river rejected him, he drowned and guilt was confirmed. The gods judged in currents. A man's innocence floated or sank. Let's go on to the forests of pre-colonial Polynesia. There, law was spoken by chieftains and reinforced by tapu, sacred prohibitions. Breaking a tapu might not result in a beating or a prison, but something worse. Spiritual exile. The offender was marked, shunned, forbidden to touch food, forbidden to sleep beneath roofs. Even his shadow was avoided. The land itself rejected him. He became leprous in life, though his skin bore no sores. He could die from starvation, or grief, or in some cases he would flee into the sea, to disappear where no human law could follow. Even silence has a tide. Now let's rise once more to the Holy Roman Empire. There, heretics were given the iron spider, a torturous device shaped like a claw, heated red-hot and used to tear the flesh from the body, especially the breasts of women accused of consorting with demons. The screams were not always public. Many tortures were conducted in echoing dungeons, not for spectacle, but for purification. The Church, in its darkest moments, believed pain could cleanse, but perhaps the strangest punishment was the drumhead confession, when soldiers were tried on the battlefield and sentenced on the spot. Some were broken on the wheel, others shot at dawn, but all beneath the roll of drums, steady, measured, the heartbeat of martial law. Justice there did not wait for cities or courts, it marched. And now we return to Africa, to Ethiopia, where emperors ruled with fierce tradition. In certain dynasties, blinding was used to secure power. Brothers, cousins, rivals, all blinded to prevent them from claiming the throne. A prince might wake one day a man and go to sleep in darkness. It was not death, it was containment. They lived, often richly, but they would never rule. Sight became the coin of ambition. Now, rest your mind. Let it wander freely through what you've heard. Let your breath move gently, as if brushing the dust from old scrolls. We have walked through blood and silence, through law and superstition, through deserts, tundras, rivers, and temples. And still, the world is not done punishing. There are more tales to tell. Each tale, a whisper deeper into the past. Each punishment, a thread in the tapestry of human judgment. Tangled, brutal, and bizarre. Now we drift toward the ancient Balkans, into the lands of the Illyrians and Thracians, peoples whose punishments are only lightly traced through Roman and Greek eyes. Among their rites, there existed a curious punishment for oath-breakers and cowardly warriors, being bound beneath the bones of animals. The condemned would be strapped down in a ritual pit or shallow grave, and then covered in the cleaned skeletons of oxen, deer, and wolves, the very beasts associated with strength, loyalty, and wilderness. The bones were lashed together, skull placed upon skull, horns pointing skyward. The man beneath, he could not breathe easily, could not move, and above all, he could not be seen. He became, in effect, a living grave, surrounded not by dirt, but by the memory of creatures who had never broken their instinct. It wasn't always fatal, but it was isolating. Days beneath bone. They believed that shame could be carved not only into skin, but into spirit. Let us rise now, gently, carefully, to the Tibetan plateau. There, in ancient sects of pre-Buddhist tribal law, a form of punishment existed that had no prison, no execution, and no beating. It was known as soul stripping. The accused, often a spiritual offender, would be taken to a sacred hill at dawn, tied and surrounded by chanting elders. They would not touch him, not feed him, not harm him, but for hours they would chant his name, slowly, repeatedly, then strip it away. They would speak his misdeeds aloud, call down ancestral spirits to listen, then assign him a new name, a cursed one, a wordless one, sometimes a name never spoken again. He would descend the hill not as himself, but as an unperson. No wife could take him back. No village would accept his labor. Even dogs barked at his scent, it was said. To be alive, but erased, became its own exile. Now let us move with the clouds, westward, to the Celtic lands, Ireland, and northern Gaul. Among the Druids, punishment was tied not only to law, but to story. A thief, if unrepentant, might be punished with bardic damnation. The bards, keepers of oral tradition, would compose verses mocking the offender, embedding his shame into song. The tale would spread like wind across clans and hills, carried at firesides and feasts. The shame was generational. Children might grow up hearing their father's disgrace in ballads. Entire bloodlines would wear it like a stain. For those who understood the weight of legacy, this was heavier than shackles. To be sung in disgrace, forever. Let us leave those songs behind. Let the mist carry them away. Now, to Mesoamerica again. But not the Aztecs this time. The Zapotecs of present-day Oaxaca believed deeply in balance, and punishment often sought not cruelty, but equilibrium. Yet one punishment stands out for its ritualism: nail sewing. A criminal would have his fingers sewn together using cactus needles and sinew, slowly, without sedation. Once bound, his hands were then wrapped in sacred cloth, trapping them in a state of enforced uselessness. For 7 days, he couldn't work, not eat without help, not gesture in defense or prayer. At the end of the cycle, the sinew would be cut. But if the wounds had festered, the hands might remain damaged, a permanent memory, scarred into the tools of man's will. Now, let us drift to the Ottoman Empire, where punishment often walked a knife's edge between law and theatre. One punishment, obscure, theatrical, and rare, was known as the sack of shadows. A noble or official, guilty of betrayal, might be stripped of title and taken in secret to the edge of the Bosphorus. There, at night, he would be sewn into a velvet sack, face exposed, body contained, alongside a stone idol. Then, gently, silently, the sack would be pushed into the water. He would sink, holding in his final breath beside a faceless statue. No tomb, no grave, no inscription. His soul, the Ottomans believed, would wander, bound forever to the silent idol in the deep. It was not just death, it was companionship with the forgotten. Let us surface now, briefly, to medieval England, where punishments could be laced with dry cruelty, delivered with a judge's cold precision. One such punishment was peine forte et dure. A person who refused to enter a plea in court, guilty or not, could not be tried. And so, they were forced to decide. Laid on the ground, a board placed upon them, and weights, stones, iron, wood, slowly added. They were pressed, minute by minute. If they pled, the trial continued. If they remained silent, the weight grew, until the breath stopped. It could take hours, days. The silence became the sentence. Sometimes silence was a strategy used to preserve property for heirs, as conviction would forfeit all assets. And so some men chose to be crushed in silence for the sake of family. Let that image settle, heavy, compressed. And let's travel now to pre-Columbian Colombia among the Muska people. There, among highland lakes and sacred gold, punishment could be ritualistic, surreal, even poetic. For major betrayal or blasphemy, the sentence might be the long circle. The condemned was made to walk a sacred ring path, a trail carved in the earth in the shape of a sun or serpent. The walk would take hours. It was walked barefoot, repeated daily. Each step was to be done in silence. By the end of the week, or the month, the soles of the feet would be torn, the mind unraveled. If the condemned tried to cheat, the gods were believed to intervene. Those who completed the punishment were often changed, humbled, broken, or, occasionally, enlightened. Pain as pilgrimage. Now, feel your breath soften again. Let these ancient echoes settle like sand. We have touched the punishment of flesh and spirit, the symbolic and the savage, the poetic and the pitiless. The lantern grows dim, the air grows heavier, but the stories remain, patient, waiting. Now we drift gently into the dense forests and sacred valleys of ancient Burma, now Myanmar, where kings ruled not only with swords, but with omens and astrology. Punishments there were laced with cosmic symbolism. One particularly haunting punishment for treason or sacrilege was known as the tiger's breath. The condemned would be stripped and chained to a wooden frame near the jungle's edge. Then, hunks of raw meat would be tied to his body, beneath the arms, across the chest, between the thighs. The scent would carry, and soon the jungle would stir. No crowd, no judges, only the watching monks from afar and the whispering trees. If the jungle spared him overnight, it was considered a sign of innocence or divine intervention. Rare, but not unheard of. More often the forest took him, quietly, violently, or slowly, depending on the mood of its hunger. Judgment by nature, by fang and silence. Let us move now to the island world of the ancient Filipinos, the Visayans and Tagalogs. Here, one of the strangest punishments was reserved for social betrayal, such as false gossip, broken alliances, or blasphemy against ancestors. It was called the salt coffin. The accused would be packed into a wooden box, knees to chest, arms folded, with layers of rock salt poured in around them. The salt drew out moisture. It burned small wounds. It preserved while destroying. The box was sealed and kept for 3 days in the village square. Food was denied. The salt did its slow, abrasive work. After 3 days, if the person lived, they were released, marked forever by cracked lips, peeling skin, and near madness. If they died, the box was buried without ceremony. The salt had decided Let that sting fade now, let the burn recede, and let us cross great waters to the kingdom of Benin in West Africa. There, among towering earth walls and bronze-cast shrines, justice was intertwined with spectacle. One bizarre punishment for lying in royal court was known as the Dance of Blades. The accused would be required to perform a ceremonial dance, barefoot, shirtless, holding a blade in each hand. Elders would chant, drummers would beat the rhythm. If the man faltered, if he slipped or dropped a blade, or if the drummers ceased before he finished, his lie was confirmed. Then the blades were turned inward. The dance became his last. But if he finished, unscathed, steady, in time, he was considered cleared by the spirits, his truth proven through the balance of motion and control. To lie was to stumble. To survive was to move with the gods. Now drift onward, through sand and silence, into the Abbasid Caliphate, a golden age of scholars and empire. But even there, justice could be cruel, dressed in scholarly robes. For the crime of false prophecy, one punishment was called the cage of tongues. The condemned man was strapped to a wooden chair in the bazaar and caged in a lattice made of woven reed. He could not move nor lie down, but most peculiar. Dozens of dried ox tongues were hung from the cage, dangling around his face and mouth. Each tongue was meant to represent a false word he had spoken. Children would mock him. Poets would recite verses around him. He was left for 7 days, fed through a reed straw. Flies gathered. Dust settled. He did not bleed. He did not burn. But his own mouth, the source of the crime, became a prison. And so, many chose silence ever after. Let us breathe now. Inhale the dust. Exhale the judgment. We move again, slowly, into the eastern steppes, to the ancient Scythians and Sarmatians, nomads, horse peoples, fierce and proud. Their punishments were often as swift as their arrows, but among the nobility, for betrayal, there was something far stranger. The curse saddle. A traitor would be lashed to a dead horse, his own, if possible, and forced to ride it in death. The animal would be propped up, legs stiffened with wooden rods, and dragged across the plains by other horses. The bound man, tied atop the corpse, would bounce and jolt with every movement. It was said the ride shook his soul loose from his body. If he survived a day of this, broken, bruised, reeking of rot, he would be released into exile. If not, the steppe claimed them both. They believed that the bond between man and horse could carry punishment beyond death. Let's ride from that wind into something even older. Ancient Sumer, among the first civilizations, where cuneiform carved laws into clay, where ziggurats reached for heaven. And yet, punishment was primitive, ritualistic, enduring. One strange punishment, almost absurd in its formality, was the naked reed walk. A merchant caught cheating in weights or prices would be stripped naked and forced to walk between 2 rows of townspeople, each armed with a single reed stalk. They would strike him as he passed. The sting was sharp, but rarely fatal. The greater wound came from the ritual, from the exposed body, the laughter of children, the eyes of neighbors. After the walk, the man was forbidden from selling goods for 7 moons. If he did, the punishment was repeated. Only this time, the reeds were set on fire, and the laughter was not so gentle. Now drift from reeds and sun to the rain-lashed isles of medieval Scotland, where one punishment stands out for its spectral cruelty, the waking bell. A thief or liar might be chained to a church gate with a heavy bell affixed around his neck. The bell was designed to ring with every movement, every twitch, every breath, disturbing the villagers' rest. For 3 nights he stood there, awake, alone. The people slept in shifts, so someone always heard the sound. If the bell stopped, if he tried to rest, he would be flogged. Sleep became forbidden, and when he was freed, the ringing often echoed in his ears for days. Punishment by insomnia, judgment by noise. Now let us lay that bell to rest. Let its sound fade into the soil. We've wandered far, through ages and empires, through cruelty dressed as order and justice tangled with myth. But there are still more, deeper into the folds of forgotten justice, where sleep treads gently and history moans faintly beneath centuries of dust. We turn now to the Khmer Empire, in what is now Cambodia, home to the mighty Angkor Wat and the labyrinthine corridors of divine rule. Here, punishment was not only about guilt, but imbalance. The world was meant to be ordered. Offences were seen as disruptions of that balance. One of the strangest punishments for crimes against the divine, such as speaking against the king or priesthood, was called the crocodile blessing. The condemned was taken to a sacred pool known to be inhabited by crocodiles, believed to be spirit guardians of the land. A monk would chant over the water. Flowers were thrown into the pool. Then the criminal, shackled, drugged with palm wine, but conscious, was gently lowered into the water. If the crocodiles ignored him, he was pulled out and declared innocent, touched by the gods. But if they approached, if one even so much as brushed against his flesh, he was left, and the jungle quickly reclaimed what was unworthy. To be judged by crocodile breath, it was not only a punishment, but an omen, a karmicus shamlalas. And so we drift south, to the heartlands of Java in ancient Indonesia. Here, in the kingdoms of Majapahit and Srivijaya, where shadow puppets told tales of gods and kings, punishment could also be theatrical. There existed a punishment called the laughing mirror. The guilty, usually a corrupt official or bribe-taker, was painted with bright dyes and powders. He was dressed in women's robes with exaggerated makeup. Then he was forced to sit before a great bronze mirror in the market square, surrounded by jesters and masked dancers. For 3 days, people paraded by, mocking him, tossing rice husks and singing nursery rhymes twisted into insults. He could not speak. He could not cry. If he laughed, genuinely, without defiance, he was spared and freed. If he showed anger or shame, his tongue was burned with clove oil, and he was exiled barefoot through the volcanic hills. It was a punishment designed not to break the body, but the self-image, a slow erosion of ego in front of the laughing face of society. Let that laughter fade, drift, dissolve. Now we descend again into the dark courtrooms of medieval China during the Tang and Song dynasties. Justice here was elegant, yet often terrifying in its precision. One punishment for bureaucratic treason or leaking imperial secrets was known as paper slicing. The accused would be wrapped in scrolls of thin rice paper, hundreds of layers, each soaked in ink from state records. They were then bound with cords soaked in vinegar and dried. As the body warmed, the cords tightened, the paper stiffened. Each breath grew sharper. The ink bled into the pores. By the end, the condemned's body was stained, literally inscribed with guilt. He became a document, a cautionary tale. Sometimes his body was hung on the palace gate, and students of law would write poems on the drying parchment skin. A man turned manuscript. Let us leave this image now. Let the ink dry in silence. From China, we sail north, into the cold halls of Viking justice. Contrary to modern myth, the Norse had a complex and often highly symbolic system of law, but when vengeance was required, it could be both brutal and deeply ritualistic. One of the rarest and most terrifying punishments, likely used only in extreme betrayal, was the blood eagle. The condemned, often a traitor to kin or lord, would be laid chest down. His ribs were split from the spine, one by one. The lungs pulled out, fanned across the back like wings. It is said that salt was rubbed into the wounds, that the victim might remain alive through the ritual, though this is debated even among historians. What mattered most was the message, that the one who had betrayed now wore the wings of pain, not honor. The blood eagle was a warning to all, that disloyalty would not only kill you, it would turn your death into a myth. Let us not linger here too long. Let the wings fold. Let the wind carry us away, now, to the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, before the rise of modern law, before caliphates. Among nomadic tribes, justice was swift, but certain crimes, like adultery within an honored family, called for something else. The sand sleep. The accused would be taken at dawn into the dunes. A shallow pit was dug. They were placed inside, arms at their sides, and the sand was gently poured over them. Not to bury, but to insulate. Only their face was left uncovered. Then the tribe left. For hours, sometimes days. If a family member returned to remove the sand, it was a sign of forgiveness. The punishment was considered complete, and the person reintegrated. If no one came, the sun did the rest. It was not the sand that killed. It was the silence, the waiting, the realization that you had become unclaimed. Now drift, lightly, to the plains of Anatolia, where Hittite kings ruled thousands of years ago. Among their strangest punishments was ritual clay breaking. A criminal would be molded in effigy by temple artists, a clay figure painted with his name and crimes. Then, during a public ritual, the real man stood beside his figure. If the gods were angered, the priestess would smash the effigy, and then the man. Bones were broken in mimicry of the clay, arm for arm, leg for leg. He became a reflection shattered by divine decree. But if the priestess left the figure whole, the sentence was lifted. Sometimes, clay was more merciful than kings. Let's drift now, slowly, into the Americas once more, to the ancient Puebloans of the American Southwest, the ancestral Hopi, Zuni, and others. Here, punishment for spiritual disobedience, such as mocking a Kachina spirit or refusing ritual participation, could be the wall of whispers. The offender was tied facing a rock cliff where the wind echoed sharply. All night, masked figures of the tribe would whisper ancestral names and ghost stories behind him. No food, no movement, just the sound of voices that seemed to crawl across the stone. After 3 nights, the man was untied. Some returned to the tribe, humbled. Others walked into the desert, never to be seen again. It was not pain that broke them. It was the sound of being watched by the unseen. Now, let us lie still. Let us fold these stories into soft cloth. Let the dust of ancient courts settle. Let the screaming mouths of history fall silent. We move onward, through shadowed corridors of time, where the torchlight of memory flickers and the ground is paved with strange, forgotten justice. Each tale another soft stone on the path towards sleep. Now we wander into the ancient lands of the Etruscans, a civilization older than Rome, whose rituals were thick with omens and sacred boundaries. Among them existed a punishment known as the mouth of iron. Reserved for false prophets and fraudulent soothsayers, the condemned was led to a ceremonial mask, forged of blackened iron, shaped into a grotesque face with its mouth wide open in eternal scream. The criminal's head was forced inside. Then incense and smouldering herbs were lit beneath it. The iron trapped the smoke, slow, acrid, sacred. The guilty would not burn, not bleed, but they would choke, coughing out their lies within the mouth of metal, eyes wide, mind spinning. If they survived, they were silenced for life. If not, the mask remained, waiting for the next voice unworthy of divination. And so the Etruscans silenced, not with the sword, but with smoke. Let us drift from smoke to salt again, to the ancient coasts of Phoenicia. Master traders, sailors, makers of purple dye and lore. Here, punishment for piracy or betrayal of the sea came in a form called the rope of foam. The guilty would be tied to the prow of a ship, not during storm, but during calm. The salt spray would whip them. The sun would burn them. The sea foam would dry and crust across their lips. For 3 days they sailed like that, between islands. No water, no shade, no word. If they survived the voyage, they were freed and exiled, never again permitted to step onto Phoenician shore. If they died, they were cut loose and left to the sea. The rope of foam was not tightened by hands, but by waves. From salt water now to the cold wind of ancient Rus, among the early Slavs and Vikings who settled the river routes. One of the crueler punishments in those wild, frost-bitten lands was known as the frost cradle. The condemned, often an arsonist or witch, was tied in a fetal position and placed in a wooden trough filled with snow and ice. Then they were rocked, slowly, gently, for hours. Villagers watched. The air was filled with the sounds of creaking wood and clinking frost. Some went mad before the cold claimed them. Others wept until their tears froze against their cheeks. It was not designed for spectacle, but for reflection, for slow, numbing realization. When the cradle stopped, they either awoke changed or never awoke at all. Now, a breath, a pause, a stillness. We drift west into the highlands of Ethiopia, into the kingdom of Aksum, where stone obelisks pointed toward the sky, and justice was said to descend from the heavens. A punishment here, reserved for prideful nobles or blasphemers, was called the judgment of the sky eye. The condemned would be made to lie on a slab of polished obsidian, staring up at the sun's reflection. They were given a single bowl of water and told not to blink. Guards would surround them, silent, still. As hours passed, the reflection of the sun blinded them slowly. But if they moved, if they drank the water or closed their eyes, it was taken as a sign of guilt, and they were cast into the desert. Only those who endured the burning gaze, who showed no fear of the heavens, were allowed to walk free. The sky was their witness, the stone their judge. Now let that sky dim. Let the clouds roll over it like soft curtains. We sail again, this time to the Pacific, to ancient Polynesia, the scattered islands of gods, sharks, and ancestors etched into stone. One peculiar punishment among the Marquesas Islands was called the turtle cage. For taboo violations, Often against food laws or incest, the guilty were tied into a bamboo frame shaped like a sea turtle, then floated offshore during high tide. The ocean would carry them. The turtle drifted. Sometimes they returned, carried by the current and forgiven by the gods. Sometimes the turtle did not come back. They believed that if the spirits accepted the soul, the sea would keep it. If not, it would spit the man back to shore, marked by salt and silence, to be judged by tide, by drift, by island memory, from drifting turtles to stone foundations once more, to ancient Korea under the Silla dynasty. There existed a punishment called the moon seat, a carved stone chair set atop a hill facing the night sky. The criminal, often someone guilty of disturbing communal peace, would be tied to it at dusk and left until sunrise. The seat was smooth, cold, and shaped to tilt the body upward, forcing the neck into constant strain, the eyes to stare into the stars. It was believed that the stars could realign a person's spirit. That shame under their light would seep into the bones. Some fell asleep and dreamed of ancestors. Others woke in tears, unable to speak of what they'd seen. The moon seat was not pain, but pressure. Not torture, but trance. Let that moon dim now. Let the chair cool. Let us return to warmer sands, to North Africa, to the Berbers, ancient tribes of the Sahara. Among them was a punishment whispered more than written, the mirror stone. A man accused of murder without proof would be taken to a lone black rock in the desert. There, a circle of elders would stand, and the man would be forced to stare into the stone's surface. They believed that if he had truly killed, his reflection would twist, even if only slightly. And if it did, he was buried there, beneath the rock. If it did not, the accuser was given the same trial. The mirror stone judged not by what was seen, but by what was seen changing. A justice of reflection, of heat, of illusion. Now rest for a moment. You've walked through deserts and drowned in sea foam, stood before iron mouths and stone eyes. We are not yet at the end, but closer now. The path narrows now, but still it winds onward, through the deep hush of history's forgotten corners, where the strangest sentences are carved not in books, but in breath and dust. Let us turn our gaze east, to the early Tokugawa era of Japan. Among its more haunting punishments was one known as the silence box. Used for monks who violated vows of discipline or holy order, the silence box was a narrow wooden structure, tall enough to stand in, but too narrow to sit or bend. The inside was lined with hundreds of prayer slips, sutras, blessings, names of the dead. The offender was placed inside for 3 days and nights with a single candle flickering in the darkness. There was no food, only a single bowl of water. The wax would drip. The prayers would rustle with breath. The words of the ancestors were all around him, staring, whispering. When released, the monk's punishment was not considered complete unless he emerged voiceless, by vow or by trauma. Many did not speak again for years. The silence of paper, the pressure of the past, a punishment made not of violence, but of presence. Now the candle dims. We float across waters once more to the river kingdoms of West Africa, to the Ashanti, where tradition and balance ruled every breath. Here, the punishment for violating sacred oaths, especially those made before gods or ancestors, was something called the soul chain. The guilty were bound in bronze shackles and forced to spend 7 days in absolute stillness inside a shrine. No food, no water. But more than that, they were not permitted to blink, yawn, or tremble. Priests watched. Offerings were left beside them. At night, drums were played so softly they blurred into the edge of silence. If the accused moved, even slightly, it was believed the gods had found them guilty and their soul would be chained in the next life. Sometimes they were released physically, but their minds were never whole again. Punishment here was eternal, beyond the body, beyond the now. Let us breathe, gently, release the weight of eternity, and drift north to the pagan Slavic forests, where before the Christianization of Kievan Rus, justice was often decided beneath the trees. One punishment, reserved for breaking the peace during sacred gatherings, was known as the bark oath. The wrongdoer was stripped and tied to a tree, one believed to be inhabited by a forest spirit, often birch or pine. Then, pieces of bark were peeled and placed against the skin, each soaked in honey and ash. Bees would come, flies, ants. But more than this, villagers would encircle the tree and whisper the crimes into the leaves. If the tree withered in the weeks that followed, it was believed the spirit had accepted the punishment, and the man would be banished, cursed. If the tree thrived, he was forgiven. Punishment through communion, through silence, through listening to what the forest would choose. Now, the wind in those trees settles. We cross once more to the golden temples and sacred jungles of ancient Thailand, Siam. A particularly strange punishment for spiritual fraud, often practiced by those pretending to heal or channel spirits, was the dance of the fireflies. The offender was coated in resin and sweet syrup, then left alone at twilight in the middle of a field. Dozens of lanterns, shaped like glowing insects, were lit around him. Real fireflies mingled with illusion. Birds circled overhead. He was required to remain still, believing he was being watched by spirits in disguise. Monks would chant nearby, unseen, creating the impression that the very air was alive and judging him. The next morning, he was washed in a sacred stream. If he confessed, he was reborn into temple service. If he remained defiant, he was exiled, not as a criminal, but as a man who lies to the sky. Punishment by illusion, redemption through surrender. From glowing insects now to the red sands of ancient Australia, among the Aboriginal peoples where the Dreamtime shaped law and justice. One of the most mysterious punishments was called shadow cutting. If a person broke a taboo, like revealing a sacred songline or stealing ritual tools, they would not be physically harmed. Instead, a group of elders would perform a secret ritual where a stick was cast in the offender's direction and their shadow symbolically cut from the earth. From that moment forward, the individual was considered dead to the tribe. No one would speak their name. No one would look at them. No food, no tools, no fire would be shared. The body lived, but the soul wandered. Some chose to walk into the desert and never return. Others went mad, trying to speak into a world that no longer responded. There was no pain, only absence. Only the unbearable weight of being unseen. And now, we glide into the highlands of the Andes, to the Inca, where justice flowed from the mountains like snowmelt into the valleys. Here, one strange punishment was called the echo sentence. A liar or oath-breaker was taken to a cliff known for its echoes. He was required to shout his name, then his crime, and wait for the mountain to answer. This ritual was repeated at dawn, noon, and dusk for 3 days. If the echoes returned cleanly, as if the gods wished to hear him. He was forgiven and embraced again by the village. But if the echoes were distorted, broken, or lost to wind, he was led to the edge of the cliff and told to walk away into the mists. Most returned, some didn't. The punishment lay in the listening, not to the people, but to the mountain, a judgment measured in echoes. Let the echoes fade now. Let the mountain close its lips. And so, we near the edges of this long path. You have wandered through frost and fire, through shadows and starlight, through punishments that spoke not only to crime, but to soul. There are still more, waiting beneath temple stones, beneath forgotten laws, in bones unearthed and scrolls half burned, deeper into the hush of forgotten memory, into corners so quiet that even history seems to breathe more slowly. Let us step softly now into ancient Malta, the island of stone temples and cyclopean ruins, older than the pyramids themselves. Among the priest-kings of this Neolithic civilization, punishment was rare but steeped in ritual. One of the most unsettling forms was known only in fragments, whispered as the hollow chant. For blasphemy or defilement of sacred grounds, the offender would be taken deep into the Hal Saflieni Hippogum, an underground temple of echo and stone. There, in a small chamber known for its acoustic properties, the man would be sealed inside. From above, priestesses would chant through stone holes, their voices amplified, warped, layered by the chamber's strange resonance. To the man inside, the sound became a chorus of thunderous murmurs, godlike and indistinguishable from thought. He was given no light, no food, only the sound of judgment. Many emerged days later, eyes hollow, crawling, weeping, unable to describe what they'd heard. Others never came out at all. It was punishment by voice, but not human voice. Let us rise, carefully, out of the stone. Now to the windswept plains of Mongolia, to the ancient Khans and their steppes, where justice travelled on horseback and lived in fire and sky. Among certain nomadic tribes, a rare punishment for those who betrayed the spirit of hospitality by poisoning guests or stealing from travellers was known as the Tent of Mirrors. A small yurt was constructed entirely from polished copper plates and reflecting hides. The guilty was placed inside, naked, with a single candle. The heat would rise, the flame would flicker. Every wall showed him his own body, multiplied, stretched, distorted. There were no shadows, only self. For 2 nights, the man lived in that mirrored yurt. He saw himself from every angle, saw the animal, saw the coward, saw the truth. When he emerged, he was either ready to confess and seek atonement, or he ran screaming into the steppe. The tent was then taken down, and the copper used to make bowls for the tribe, as if his punishment could be digested and passed on. Now we ride from the cold, open grass into the heat of Arabia once more, to the Nabateans, the builders of Petra. In their canyon-walled city, punishment was rare but theatrical. One such sentence was called the Sandstone Veil. The offender, usually a defiler of tombs or secrets, was painted in red ochre and made to stand within a narrow crevice in the cliff wall at sunrise. There, thin sheets of silk, soaked in camel milk and spice oils, were hung in front of him, fluttering lightly in the wind. As the sun passed through the silks, patterns danced across his skin. The people watched from below, silent. The symbolism was clear. He had tried to pass through what was veiled. Now he, too, would become a veil. If he stood still until the sun vanished and did not collapse or cry or plead, he was allowed to return. If not, he was wrapped in the very silks and taken to live in the tombs he had once profaned. The sandstone watched and remembered. Now let the wind rise in those canyon walls, from desert to the jungles of Central America. To the Maya, astronomers, builders, timekeepers, a punishment here, called the calendar cut, was saved for those who defied the sacred timing of rituals, such as beginning a planting ceremony on an unlucky day or disturbing the passage of a Baktun. The criminal was brought before the priest mathematicians and his body ritually divided, symbolically, not through harm, but through paint and posture. Arms and legs were tied to cardinal directions. Lines were drawn in ink across the body, representing sacred time intervals. He became a living calendar. Then the people walked past him, offering prayers and tokens, not to the man, but to the image of disrupted time he had become. He was forced to remain in this position for 5 full days, one for each unlucky day at the end of the Maya calendar cycle. Then he was washed and freed. Some were never the same. Others became devoted keepers of time. Now let the calendar close. Now we turn to the highlands of ancient Albania, among the tribes of the Balkans, where blood feuds and honor codes, the Kanun, ruled for centuries. A grim but oddly ceremonial punishment here was the mirror vigil, used when one member of a family killed another, violating the sacred blood bond. The killer would be locked in a room with a full-length mirror and a candle placed between them and their reflection. They were to sit, cross-legged, and stare into their own eyes as the candle slowly burned down. If they broke eye contact, the punishment began again the next night. Only after 3 full vigils, with no interruptions, was the family permitted to formally forgive the crime and end the blood feud. Some begged to be killed instead. Others completed it and emerged, changed. The mirror gave no justice, only reflection. Let that reflection dim now, and now into the shadows of the Roman provinces, far from the Senate, in the lonely outposts where law still had to feel like Rome. One of the cruelest punishments inflicted by frontier governors was called the echo pit, a hole carved in soft earth. The condemned, a deserter or spy, was placed inside and buried to the neck. Then a metal horn was blown above his head, loud, piercing, and again, each hour, each sunrise, the horn would echo across the valley and back down into the pit. They said a man could survive the horn, but not the waiting between the blasts. No blood spilled, no violence shown, only the sound of war stretched into madness. Let the horn fall silent now, and so the road continues, winding, stretching, but always softening now, as if even the harshest judgments grow tired. Let us move now to the mist-wrapped mountains of ancient Tibet, a land of sacred peaks and spinning prayer wheels where punishment was often cloaked in spirituality. There, for those who defiled monasteries or disturbed sacred grounds, there existed a solemn and surreal rite known as the Wheel of Breath. The condemned was not beaten or jailed. Instead, he was seated in the middle of a circle of spinning prayer wheels, dozens of them, large and small, turning endlessly. He was bound, not tightly, but in stillness. Incense smoldered nearby. Monks chanted in deep, vibrating tones. But the key was silence. The criminal was forbidden from exhaling audibly. He had to breathe, through his nose, through his lips, without making a sound, lest he be deemed unworthy to share the same air as the prayers surrounding him. It was a punishment of restraint, of breath, of being crushed not by chains, but by the weight of sacred air. Most emerged with trembling lungs and teary eyes, and a vow to never disturb the holy silence again. Let the chant fade now, gently. Now, to ancient Hungary, in the time of the Magyar horsemen. A people of fierce warriors, but with laws as strange and poetic as their songs. One such punishment, reserved for oath-breakers and treaty violators, was called the saddle sleep. The offender was lashed to the back of a horse, not to be dragged or beaten, but to remain mounted for 3 days and 3 nights, unable to dismount or rest his spine. The horse was led in slow circles around the camp, watched by silent warriors. At night, the rider would sway, muscles locked, joints screamed. But to fall asleep and fall off was shameful, a mark of dishonor that would bar one from any future oath or pact. Only those who endured all 3 nights, sleepless, stiff, hollow-eyed, were considered worthy to speak promises again. Their word was then believed to be bound by pain and sleep withheld. Now the horse slows. The circles end. Let's ride west again, to the ruins of ancient Carthage, that proud and burning city, once Rome's rival. Among the Carthaginians, traders and statesmen were punished not only for crimes, but for misjudging fate. To misread an omen before war or bring bad luck upon a voyage was grave, and the sentence was the red oiling. The condemned was coated in thick red-dyed olive oil, the same pigment used in burial rites, then paraded through the streets in silence. He was not jeered nor touched, but no one would meet his eyes. He was treated as though already dead, a ghost walking. Children were pulled away from his path. Animals would not be permitted to pass near him. At sunset, he was washed in seawater by temple slaves. If he sobbed or pleaded, he was exiled. But if he bore it all, the silence, the oil, the invisible death, he was allowed to live. Punishment through absence, through the haunting of one's own life. Now, the oil dries, the ghost fades. We shift north again, to the forests of Gaul, before Caesar's legions carved them into provinces. Here, among the Celtic Druids, one of the most profound punishments was called the root fast. It was for those who had violated sacred natural sites, trees used in ritual, springs of prophecy, burial groves. The criminal was tied near the roots of a sacred oak, buried waist-deep in soil, not to die, but to remain for 9 days. During that time, no one could speak to him. He was given only water and herbs through hollow reeds. It was believed that the tree's roots would draw the truth from his bones, that by being still with the earth, he would either be healed or erased. If the tree showed signs of stress, shedding leaves or splitting bark, the man was deemed guilty and his lineage cursed. But if new shoots emerged, he was welcomed again and crowned with oak leaves. Let us move now, across sea and wind, into the Aegean, to the lesser-known city-states of ancient Thrace, rougher and wilder than polished Athens. Here existed a strange punishment called the Mask of the Unspoken. A bronze faceplate, blank, expressionless, was strapped to the head of one who spread lies, especially those that provoked war or dishonored the dead. The mask had no holes for the mouth, only for the eyes and breath. The offender had to wear it for 1 full moon cycle. He could eat only liquids. He could not speak. He could not even hum. It wasn't painful, but it was suffocating to the mind. The idea was to smother false words by sealing the mouth with silence and wait. When the mask was removed, the man was brought before the elders and had to speak only 1 sentence. A vow. truthful or false. It would be his last permitted public statement. He chose his words carefully. Now the mask cools and is placed back in the temple shadows. Let us walk east once more, into Persia, beneath the rule of Darius, where law was both elegant and immense. In the far reaches of the empire, some provinces used a punishment called the sand shadow. When a man disrupted trade routes or disrespected Zoroastrian ritual space, he was taken to a vast flat of white sand and made to walk a spiral pattern, barefoot and blindfolded. He walked in circles for hours, guided only by rope and memory. The spiral was a sacred symbol, meant to represent the path of purification. If he completed the full spiral and returned to the center without breaking the rope, he was forgiven. If he strayed or stepped out, the walk began again the next day. Sometimes the spiral took 3 days, sometimes more. The crime was erased not through pain, but through endless, dizzying return. Now let the sand drift quietly in the wind. You've walked through spirals and stood beneath trees. You've worn silence like chains and stared into polished stone. Each punishment a ritual, a rhythm, a slow pressure against the soul. We journey into that peculiar vein of history where justice twisted into something almost dreamlike, where punishment was no longer merely deterrent, but performance, symbol, myth. Now we descend into the shadows of ancient Sardinia, to the Nuragic civilization, shrouded in mystery, its stone towers rising like teeth from the hills. There, among a people whose gods spoke in thunder and wind, existed a punishment known simply as the Whispering Stones. Reserved for those who desecrated ancestral altars or tampered with burial stones, this sentence was less violent, more surreal. The condemned was taken to a sacred valley filled with menhirs, towering stones arranged in silent rows. At twilight, he was blindfolded and left alone among them, tasked with finding a single marked stone using only his ears. It was said that the right stone, when touched, would produce a soft, resonant hum, a whisper from the ancestors. But the wind played tricks. Echoes drifted, hours stretched. Some wandered afield all night, touching cold, unyielding slabs in the dark. If he found the stone before dawn, he was released. If not, he was made to remain, blindfolded and kneeling beside it for another full day, as the whispers circled and sleep retreated. A punishment of patience, of sound, of ancient breath. Now the stones grow still once more. Across the sea, we glide to ancient Etruria, home of the mysterious Etruscans, whose rituals were older than Rome and more arcane. Among their temple keepers, a punishment existed called the Ink of Forgetting. For scribes who falsified records, or priests who altered sacred calendars, the penalty was symbolic but deeply disturbing. The offender was forced to recite the sacred genealogies of the gods, but each time he reached his own family's name, it was to be skipped, then overwritten on a scroll using disappearing ink made from special herbs. His lineage, erased in ritual, invisible to divine memory. The scroll would be sealed and buried in the temple of Ve, goddess of darkness, to forget your name, to vanish in the ink, a punishment less about pain than cosmic obscurity. Now the scroll dissolves, and the ink fades from time. Further we drift, into the dense forest paths of ancient Germania, where the tribal clans met under moonlight and judged by runes. There, one strange sentence was known as the trial of roots and fire. For those who burned sacred groves or felled a ritual tree, the punishment was elemental. The guilty stood barefoot in a clearing, a ring of fire behind them, and were given a wooden staff carved from the tree they had destroyed. They were told to plant the staff into the ground and wait. If it stood upright in the earth without falling for a full cycle of the moon, 29 nights, they were forgiven. But if the staff leaned or was blown down by wind, they were forced to carry it on their back until it splintered with use or rot. Some carried it for years, a false tree, never rooted, never home, a burden to match the one they took. Now the staff drops quietly into memory. Let us move again to ancient Korea under the Goryeo dynasty, where law and ritual often intertwined with the natural world. A bizarre punishment there for nobles who betrayed a royal marriage alliance or disrupted harmony in court was known as the mirror courtship. The offender would be locked in a pavilion surrounded by polished bronze mirrors and forced to rehearse, out loud and with ritual bows, a wedding proposal to his own reflection. For 7 nights he would make this mock proposal, bowing and offering wine to the mirrors, watched by silent monks. Each night the reflection aged, his own eyes growing emptier with repetition. If he performed the ritual with sincerity and silence, never laughing, never breaking form, he was spared. But if he mocked the rite or cried out in madness, he was declared unmarriageable in the eyes of heaven and banished from courtly life. The punishment lingered like a perfume, subtle, haunting, unshakable. And now let the mirrors mist. We go north again, to the Icelandic sagas, the lonely firelit halls of the Viking age. Among the Norse, justice was swift and often bloody, but some punishments were stranger than the axe. One such was the salt sleep. For sorcerers who cursed crops or twisted the runes, the lawmen devised a sentence of cold and isolation. The offender was wrapped in seal hide, smeared with salt, and placed atop a stone slab near the shore, where mist lapped like ghost breath, and gulls wept above. He was to remain there for one tide, from low to high and back again, unable to move, the salt hardening on his skin. It was said the sea judged him. If the tide reached his lips, he was taken. If not, he returned. But always his dreams afterward were of drowning, even when dry. Let the tide recede now, slow and hush and still. We drift now into Egypt, but not golden Thebes or mighty Memphis. No, to the remote oases, where exiles and mystics whispered of a forgotten rite called the feather walk. This punishment was reserved for temple dancers who betrayed their vows, or singers who cursed the gods in song. The sentenced was blindfolded and led to a long path covered in feathers. Ostrich, ibis, heron, laid end to end in silence. The task was to walk its full length barefoot without making a single feather move. Even the slightest disturbance would mean the walk began again. The feathers would be relayed by hand. Some took a day, some took weeks. The lesson was grace, the kind of stillness demanded by the divine. A slow-motion trial where every breath must be balanced by intention. The path was quiet, but not forgiving. Now the feathers still, light as dust, soft as sleep. Let us now follow the breeze west to the ancient Slavic forests, where wooden idols stood taller than men, and the world was measured in storms and firelight. Among early pagan tribunals, one eerie punishment stood out: the scream in the grove. This was for those who hunted in sacred woods, cutting down deer tied to old gods. The guilty were led to a sacred clearing, wrapped in fur and soot, and seated beneath a tree whose bark was marked by lightning. They were then made to scream, once and only once, into a carved horn that faced the sky. The scream, it was believed, would travel upward, through the horn and into the clouds. If thunder followed within the hour, it meant the gods had answered, and the man was guilty beyond pardon. If no storm came, he was spared, but it was the scream that broke most men, to shout judgment into the void and wait, listening, for divine reply. The wind holds its breath now. No thunder, not yet. Next, we descend into the fertile crescent once more, to the lands of Sumer, where law was first carved into stone, and the gods moved like serpents through rivers and reeds. One of the strangest sentences known from those early city-states was the silence of Enki. It was for scribes or temple recorders who altered the words of kings, even by accident. The punishment: to sit before a sealed clay tablet and hold their tongue for a full lunar cycle, 28 days, without uttering a single sound. They were monitored by temple officials. Even in sleep, if they spoke, the punishment began anew. To enforce this, they were surrounded by soft drums that would be struck if the slightest whisper was heard, waking them, reminding them of their vow. It was a test of stillness, of submission, of the danger in a single word. At the end, if they succeeded, their name was inscribed beneath the tablet in gold ink, the only mark allowed to accompany the king's word. Now the drums grow silent, and sleep reclaims the tongue. Let us turn north, to Byzantium. Among the shadows of the Christian Empire, some punishments took on strange, almost mythic shapes, especially for heretics who twisted scripture into rebellion. One such fate was called the Chorus of Silence. The guilty were placed within a chapel, alone, where a single chant, one phrase, often Kyrie eleison, was played softly, endlessly, on water-powered organs or wind instruments. They lived among those notes for days. No talking, no outside sound, only the holy echo. Eventually, their thoughts began to follow the rhythm. Some began to pray involuntarily. Others screamed to make it stop. If they emerged with a new chant of their own, unholy or unrepentant, they were silenced forever. If they emerged singing the same phrase, they were forgiven. Now let the music fade, softer than breath, and deeper still we go into the ash-smeared cities of ancient India, among the smouldering fires of Varanasi and the temple-laden Ghats. For those who defiled sacred texts or misused mantras, especially Brahmins who taught forbidden knowledge, there was the fire fast. The offender was forbidden from touching food or water unless it passed through fire. Every bite was to be scorched, every sip boiled and cooled. They wore a crown of incense sticks, lit and smouldering throughout the day. The scent would cling to them, a walking fire altar. This would last for 12 days. If they survived, they were declared purified. If they failed, they were considered consumed by the very flame they disrespected. Some came to speak of visions in the smoke. Others spoke no more. Now the incense curls upward. Ash falls. Memory remains. Let us take that final step down the corridor of echoing justice, where torches fade and ancient voices hush, and the stones remember everything so you don't have to. You have walked far, through sands where silence spoke louder than words, through gardens where whispers returned as mirrors, through chambers where breath and blink and shadow were weighed as sins. We have passed by trembling roots and frozen shores, watched the sun as both witness and judge, and seen how the ancients, those solemn architects of lore and myth, shaped their punishments not only to wound the body, but to etch into the soul. Yet as strange, as severe, as bizarre as these rituals may seem to us now, lying in your quiet room with your head resting gently upon sleep's soft threshold, they were always about something deeper. Order, belonging. Fear, yes, but often awe. Because long before jail cells and paper law, there were the woods, the stars, the gods. And what a person feared most was not pain. It was disapproval from the wind, from the fire, from the river that no longer called your name. And so these punishments, the salt, the silence, the spiral, the whispering stones, were not merely to correct a crime. They were invitations to return to balance, to harmony, to the rhythm of life that pulsed just beneath the soil. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might hear it. The garden breathing, the feather path stirring, the trees holding their breath just for a moment as you pass by. And as sleep takes you, as your muscles soften and your thoughts loosen like leaves in slow wind, know that history too rests now. The punishments end, the torches dim, the scrolls curl gently closed. There is no more judgment here, only quiet, only dark, only the hush of the ancients watching kindly as dreams arrive. Sleep well, traveller. And if tomorrow you rise remembering fragments, a horn's call, a tree's whisper, a gold-painted eye in the sun, let it pass. It was only the past, keeping you company until morning returns.